Julia Rozovsky.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last session before the big party at the Mint. My name is Julia Rozovsky. I'm on the People Analytics team at Google. And like Prasad said this morning, the goal of the People Analytics team is to do research on the experience of being at work to quote him, make work suck less. So the type of work that we do is to try to answer some big questions like, how do you take bias out of the hiring process so we get the best talent possible? How do you train managers to be incredible? And the question that we're going to try to answer today, which is, what actually makes for a rock star team? So before we get started, just a quick show of hands. How many of you have been on a truly amazing team? Okay, now how many of you are attending the conference with your team members and so you feel like you have to, yeah, I know, I hear you. So hopefully we've all been on teams, a team that feels sort of like this, where it's full of individual stars who all cooperate and pitch in, a team that knows that its success is more important than their own, a team where there's just not enough multicolored Post-it notes because the ideas just keep going. But unfortunately, I'm sure there's also been times when you think you're set up to be a team like this, but somehow, despite having all the right talent in the room and all the right resources to be set up for success, you end up more like this, sort of missing out on the potential of all the people in the room. And when you think back, it's probably hard to pinpoint where some of the teams went right and the others went wrong. And so we were very, very curious about this question and spent years trying to answer it and trying to really figure out what separates our best teams at Google from the rest. So we are certainly not the first people to try to tackle this question. In fact, if you search HBR for teams, you get over 5,000 suggestions of what an effective team might look like. The issue that we ran into when we were reviewing the research is that academics try to research the things that they have most direct access to. So most of the studies that we found had populations like sophomores in college and business school students that they're referring to. And what we were curious at was, what really made the difference at Google? Can we really understand the experience of people at work, of teams full of knowledge workers that Google is full of and similar to organizations like yours? So it turns out that studying team effectiveness within the workplace is quite difficult. First of all, what is a team? Are we a team because we're in the same room? If we're in the same room a couple more times, would that make us a team? That was really, really tricky for us to figure out. The second was, how do we know, how could we tell if a team is actually effective, given how many diverse types of groups we had at Google? So we took months to try to nail down what our study was going to look like, and this is where we landed. We decided that what we mean by team effectiveness and how we're going to measure it was through a composite of 3 different perspectives. We thought about and asked executives to rate their teams. We asked team leaders, and we asked team members to rate how effective their teams were. We also pulled in as many quantitative metrics as we could find. So for example, for sales teams in our sample, we pulled in things like how they were performing against their target revenue. So once we had that nailed down, we then pulled in 180 teams to study for over the course of a couple of years. These were teams that were in engineering, so full of software engineers. There are teams that were in sales, teams that sat all over the world. Our basic focus there was we wanted to reflect the diversity of all of Google with our sample. And then lastly, we had to figure out what are we going to ask these people once we had them in the room. And we tried to cast a really wide net of what we thought might impact team effectiveness. So we asked these teams 250 questions through interviews, through surveys, and they basically went into two different categories. First, we asked them about the characteristics of people on the team. So things like their skills, their backgrounds, their personality traits. And the thinking there was, can we figure out if individual characteristics or a combination of them actually impact teams and how they perform? The other big category was around team dynamics and how teams interacted. So we asked people about how they set up their norms and their goals, how they resolve conflict. Do they socialize inside of or outside of work? And the thinking there was, is there something about the dynamics of the group that might predict the outcomes? So after we did all that, we gathered both the qualitative and the quantitative data. We started running models to try to understand which of the 250 variables that we collected actually predict team performance consistently. So what did we find? So when we started this project, we actually had no idea what we were going to find. We imagined that it was going to be pretty algorithmic. We had Google lover algorithms. We thought, it's probably going to be something like take a few ex-consultants, pair them up with some rockstar engineers, get some extroverts, voila, you have a rockstar team. Actually, we're just completely wrong. And we found something we didn't expect, which is that how a team works together was so much more important than who specifically was on the team. And specifically, there were 5 common themes that all high-performing teams at Google seem to share. So I'm going to walk you through them one by one. And this is in order of importance. So the first one was around psychological safety. So can we, as a team, take a risk without feeling insecure or embarrassed? This is the most important thing we found. Second was dependability. Can we count on each other to deliver high-quality results on time? We found that if teams can't answer this question yes, every single person on the team, they were very unlikely to be effective. Next was around structure and clarity. So are the goals, are the roles, are the execution plans on this team clear, or were they just all flying by the seat of their pants? Next is around meaning. Are we working on something that is personally meaningful to each of us? And what we saw is that people derive meaning from their work from a lot of different places, but each of them had to feel like the work was meaningful for the team to be effective. And the last one was around impact. Do we fundamentally believe that the work that we're doing matters, that it has an objective, that you can match to the organization's objective? So we saw at Google, teams that could answer yes to each of those 5 questions were disproportionately more likely to be an effective team. They're more likely to be rated effective by their executives, by the team leaders, by each other, and bring in much more revenue than teams that couldn't answer yes to this. But we also found this was a shortcut for us that we can show to leaders of where teams could focus their energy. So I want to dive a little deeper into psychological safety, because this is a dimension that we saw was foundational. So what do we actually mean by psychological safety? Because I know it sounds completely clinical, a term that you don't often hear. What we mean is psychological safety is the ability to take a risk or make yourself truly vulnerable with your team members, to throw out a crazy idea, to ask a question when you're feeling lost, to admit that you're making a mistake, without worrying too much that you'll be judged or looked down upon. So this sounds pretty easy, but Think back to a time when you were just starting a project or in the middle of a project and you felt truly, truly stuck. So stuck that it's sort of unclear where to go to from here, or whether any of the work that you've done was valuable at all. And in that moment, what you need is a thought partner, but that requires opening up and saying that you have no idea what you're doing anymore. So psychological safety is the ability to hush the fear inside your head and ask the question and know that you're not going to get judged or looked down upon as a result. So Amy Edmondson is a researcher at Harvard Business School, and she has a really good way of explaining why this matters or why this is important. And what she says is that when you withhold your ideas, you rob both yourself and your team members of small moments of learning. And that is what makes it much more difficult to execute. So what we saw at Google was that these trends were really clear in the data. And on the sales side, we actually saw that psychological safety on the team actually impacted the bottom line. So let me walk you through this. So when we looked at the sales teams that we studied and how they performed against their target revenue, what we saw was that on average, teams that express feeling unsafe missed their target revenue by about 19%, whereas teams that express feeling safe exceeded their target revenue by almost the same amount. And so I know what you're thinking. Which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? Which way does the causality go? And that's the exact same thing that we were thinking. And so what we see from our own research by studying these teams over time and external research is that psychological safety actually drives performance. And the reason that this happens is that when team members feel safe, they're much more likely to ask for help. They're much more likely to admit a mistake. They're much more likely to try new roles and responsibilities, knowing that their team has their back. And by doing this, they learn. And by learning, they become more effective. So I want to go back to here because this is the model that we saw at Google that really separated our best teams from the rest. And we're sort of shocked when we saw this because we asked 250 different types of questions, and there were so many answers that we could have seen on this wall. But we didn't see things that popped up in a lot of external research. We didn't see things that we expected, like just the number of top performers on your team will predict team outcomes, or tenure of people at Google will predict team outcomes. And what's really important is that we came up with a framework for us that we saw consistently separated teams at Google. So I want to let you know what we did with this research, because it's nice to do research, but if you can't figure out a way to actually implement it, it's hard. So the first thing that we did is we started talking about it to anybody that will listen. And we found that people are really hungry for a model because, like we saw at HBR, there are a lot of different things that people thought could impact team performance and a lot of different levers that people were trying to pull. The next thing that we did is we tried to create a program that will help people evaluate team effectiveness. We called this program G-Teams, and it had a couple of simple steps that will seem pretty clear to you guys. The first thing that we did is we created a really quick survey. It was a 5-minute pulse check that was based on the 5 dimensions that we saw from our research actually impacted team performance. We made this completely on demand so that any team at any time could just take this pulse to get a snapshot of how their team was doing. We then created a report that immediately when teams finished the survey would get aggregated and shared with everybody on the team, including the team leader and all of the members, that sort of summarized how things were going on each of these dimensions. Next, we asked people to carve out 90 minutes, which is a very long period of time, to sit down and actually talk about this as a team. Because we noticed when we had focus groups that what we're hearing from people is that there are a lot of conversations that people are having about business outcomes, how to operationalize them, how to drive towards their goals, but very little about actually how people were working together. And by taking that time to sort of evaluate what was going well and what was going poorly, they could move the business outcomes along. And the last thing that we did is that we collected a bunch of resources and mapped them to each of the 5 dimensions so that a team had at their disposal the things that they were working on and the resources that they could use to tackle them. So I wanted to leave you with just a few thoughts about what you could do within your own organizations to think about improving team effectiveness. The first one is to identify the needs of your own teams. We see that context really matters. For us, it was really important to dive into what was specific about knowledge workers, but we found a framework that was consistent across our many offices and across different types of teams. So you certainly don't have to invest years into a scientific study to do this. If this framework works for you, please feel free to use it. The second was measure team effectiveness. We noticed at Google that we measure individual performance, we measure organizational health, but we never took time to measure team performance. And that is the way that most of us work. And so just by introducing a very simple measurement tool, we started to change the conversation, the way people were thinking about effectiveness towards the unit of a team. So what I'd recommend there is it doesn't have to be formal. You can just ask people for feedback against the needs of your team, whatever your framework is, or you can embed it into a survey that you already have to ask about team effectiveness. And the last one is really model psychological safety. So this is, within Google and externally, something that keeps coming up as a basis of team performance. And as leaders of organizations, you have a huge role to play because employees mimic the behavior of leaders. And so there are 3 things that we'd really recommend there. The first one is to model and to frame the challenges that your company is going through or your teams are going through as an opportunity to learn instead of necessarily to execute. That changes the framework and the framing of how they approach problems. The second is to admit your own fallibility. By doing this, by saying, I might have missed something or maybe there's something I'm not seeing, you're opening up the conversation for people to be able to do the same. And then the last one is to model curiosity to your organization. So just ask way more questions than you're currently asking. And by doing that, you're signaling that it's okay for your employees to do the same. So if they don't know something, they'll ask. So before I turn it over to Q&A, what I want to leave you with is this. A lot of the research that we've done, the tools that we've created, the resources that we created for teams are all summarized on our rework site. So if any of the information might be useful in your own company, feel free to peruse this and use it. So with that, I just want to turn it over to Q&A, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions. And please use the microphone in the middle.
Hi there. I had a question about the 2 of these steps out of the 5,
Yeah.
Impact and meaning. How would you really differentiate those? Because I feel like they kind of are the same.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, how do you differentiate between impact and meaning? So the way that we think about meaning is what is important for you internally. So what motivates each individual employee to do their best work? That could be working on a very impactful project, or that could be writing code because it's something that makes you feel alive. Impact is very outward focused. It's the ability to see a connection between what you're working on and what the company's goals are. So for some people, those are very related, but what we saw in our research is actually for the majority of people, they're quite distinct. Great. If you could come up to the mic, that'd be great.
I understand that Google sees every person as an individual, as they said they said before. What happens when you have like a rock star loner who says at least that works better alone, and maybe afterwards they share their ideas and they don't want to work in teams, but you know that they are a valuable asset to the company. So how do you manage that? Because teamwork, especially in these days, is very, very important. But at the same time, you don't want to you don't want to oversee what's important for one person that is very valuable for the company.
I think that's a great question, and one that we thought about. What we ended up seeing is that the majority of the work that we were doing, the most complicated projects that we were working on, couldn't be done with a single individual. They were too complex and too big, and the scope was too huge for one person to actually be able to tackle it. Which is why I think what we're seeing is that the performance of any single individual wasn't predicting team outcomes. That even if you put 5 individual rock stars on a team, that wasn't consistently predicting team success. And most of our biggest projects were products of teams. So we sort of had to pivot and reorient the way that we were thinking about development around what is good for the team instead of the individual. And so there's a balancing act there, but we're trying to shift the way that we're developing our top talent along these dimensions instead of being the lone rock star.
Hi, what do you do when you have employees on several different teams? And is there a minimum size of team you recommend this approach for?
Yes, it's something definitely that came up in our research. We had almost everybody at Google is on a couple of different teams. Some are managerial teams, right? So everybody who reports to the same direct reports, and some just pop up and disperse for a project. We found the same results hold regardless of what kind of team you're on. So both for managerial teams and project teams. And what we were recommending is that both these types of teams use this framework. In terms of team size, there's quite a range in our study, but to go through this exercise, we're suggesting that under 10 people is actually preferable, so you can sit down and diagnose the issues together. When it's above 10, we saw that people were working more as subsets than a cohesive unit.
Hi there. What's an effective team when the team members are all over the country and time difference and everything to collaborate together when they're not in the same office?
Yeah, so we actually tested for that. We tried to figure out, we had teams who are really dispersed and working remotely, and we tried to figure out whether those types of teams were any less effective at the end of the day than teams that were sitting in the same location. And what we saw was that on average, there was no difference as long as teams had high psychological safety. So in the follow-up, the next question is, okay, then how do you develop psychological safety when you're spread across the world? And one of the things that we're seeing is that when teams are first starting up, when they're creating their norms, being in the same space is valuable. But after that initial startup period happens, it actually makes no difference where people sit.
Hi there. Question about Google products,
yeah,
and how a team kind of revolves around the Google suite of products. there's different setups that agencies will have. So is there any measurable difference, and does it bring a team closer if someone is a display expert and a search expert? Do you find that they work more cohesively because they have to kind of come together on those concepts, or is it maybe a better setup to have everyone be the product specialist, they just have divided teams or divided clients?
So I can't comment specifically on the search and display side, but I'll tell you from an organizational design perspective from this research study, what we did ask is we tried to figure out the backgrounds of every single person on the team to ask that very same question. Do the backgrounds and the skill sets, is it more important for them to be diverse, or is it more important for them to be consistent? Because you can sort of imagine it either way. We didn't find a single variable about who was on the team and people's skill sets that predicted outcomes. That is to say, there were teams full of people with the same exact skill sets, teams full of people that had completely different skill sets that had no difference in their performance.
Two questions. First one was really simple. The survey that you mentioned that the teams can take, what's it called is it on the rework side, and what's it called? Because there's a bunch of them.
Yeah, so the survey is called G-Teams. It's basically a mapping of the 5 dimensions and questions about them. On the rework site, we have examples. We don't have the survey exactly itself, because it's internal, but we have examples of the types of questions that you could ask to do it yourself.
Okay, and second question was really if you can add a little more color. You touched on it on causation versus the causality behind what you saw as cause and effect of feeling psychologically safe. How did you actually figure that there was a cause and effect on psychological safety and performance?
Yeah. So the way that we did it is that we basically, the first thing that we did is we looked at a snapshot. We asked people about the psychological safety on the team, and then we tracked their revenue numbers. And so initially the signal that we got was, wow, they're really correlated. More than anything, this is really correlated. But that's not enough, because you could just say that you're feeling pretty psychologically safe because you're killing your numbers. So we wanted to see if the way that a team feels today, whether they say we feel very safe with the people around us, whether that predicts future success, because that timing matters, right? And that's what we're able to show with our research, that the way that a team responds in this moment not only predicts their revenue, their target revenue and how they perform against it today, but in the future as well. There's also just one more thing to add there is Amy Edmondson is a researcher at HBS. I mentioned her. She's done incredible work in this area, and she has shown the exact same thing, not just with sales and engineering team, but hospital teams, teams of factory workers, and a lot of different sectors, that it comes down to this.
Did you have a follow-up? Okay. Hi, thank you. When you have a really psychologically safe environment, my guess is that you're going to end up with this great problem to have, which is that you're going to get a lot of ideas from your team because they're going to feel very safe giving those ideas, and that's a good problem to have. But how do you deal with the inevitable conflict that 2 ideas that are at odds with one another, I guess, how do you deal with the conflict that can be created by that? And how do you maintain psychological safety when you have different team members with conflicting ideas?
Mm-hmm. So I think in general, I don't think psychological safety is about being nice or avoiding conflict. I actually think it's the opposite, that when you have psychological safety, you can have conflict over ideas that can be resolved thoughtfully. One of the things that we've done is we've tried to think about the type of behaviors and signals, both verbal and nonverbal, that we're recommending managers try out in order to make the room and conversations that are full of conflict feel more productive, such as, even if you don't agree with somebody, repeat what they said. explain what you thought was valuable about that, and then state your opinion. I mean, just very small, tactical, behavioral things like make eye contact, lean in. All of those things make a room feel psychologically safe and enable you to have a much more productive conflict.
Cool.
Does that
yeah,
help?
it does. I have a small follow-up. I agree with you wholeheartedly that conflict should not be viewed as antithetical to safety, but that's my opinion, and it is not shared by all of the employees in my organization, and many of them perceive conflict. Now, I think you helped answer my follow-up by saying, like, there are things you can do to make sure that you can reduce the perception or mitigate the perception of conflict as, you know, stifling. But yeah, I was going to ask, like, I agree with you that conflict shouldn't be antithetical, but if I have members of my team who, when met with criticism, especially in an open forum, which is different than one-on-one, if they perceive that as lowering their level of safety, then I've got to deal with that perception, whether I, you know, regardless of how I feel about the role of conflict and clashing. So I think that's just something that probably is ongoing, but I appreciate I think you've given some ideas on how to mitigate that.
Yeah, and I think I think what you're saying is, I mean, spot on, and why this is tough, right? If you're on a team that doesn't feel psychologically safe, thinking about how do you resolve that? How do you make the team feel safer? Feels difficult. But I think that's where really good leaders can make a huge difference. And by modeling the type of behavior that they want others to mimic is really important. So as a leader of a team, showing people the way to resolve conflict or a way to work through that in a way that doesn't take away from psychological safety, I think is a huge plus.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, in that case, thank you so much for letting me share this information. I'll stick around if you have any other questions, and if not, check out the information on rework. Thanks so much.